What's your carnal theory?
Hey there, you're listening to Carnal Theory, where we talk with experts from around the world to learn how taking command of our sexual story affects our personal wellness, sexual experiences, and relationships with ourselves and others. Hello, everyone. I'm Abba, and today on Carnal Theory, we are honored with two guests. It's my pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Ann Wood. She is chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work at Nassau Community College in Garden City, New York, as well as the Senior Strategist for Woodhull Freedom Foundation, which is the human rights foundation working to protect sexual freedom as a fundamental human right. And for the focus of our conversation today, Elizabeth is the author of Bound, A Daughter, a Domme, and an End-of-Life Story. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you, Abba.
Also today, we are thrilled to have with us Rachel Music, who you may recognize from an interview on our sister podcast, Sex Talks with Diana. Rachel is an accomplished award-winning writer and actress, graduate of NYU and LIU, and also, for the primary context of today's conversation, the narrator of Elizabeth's work, Bound, A Daughter, a Domme, and an End-of-Life Story. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us as well.
Thrilled to be here.
So for our audience, you may or may not be familiar, but we like to start off each show asking our guests to read share their carnal theory that they've come with us today for our consideration. And this theory, it's meant to challenge presumption or perception that we might have in regards to our sexual selves. And we'll also end the episode today revisiting these theories. And we'll see if maybe over the course of just this conversation, maybe you think of things differently. So if we could kick things off, Elizabeth, could you share the theories that you've brought for our consideration?
Absolutely. So I have carnal theories about all kinds of things. The one that I really want to focus on today, though, links sexuality and illness and caregiving and mortality, which is a pretty challenging combination of things to link. So it has three parts. And part number one is that sexuality is not erased by illness or aging. Part number two is that we don't give up our human right to sexual freedom in exchange for healthcare or caregiving services. And then the last piece is maybe the most challenging, and that is that facing our mortality allows us to live our freest and fullest lives, including sexually.
I was hoping to also maybe to give our listeners a little context to start off with. Could you give your version, and then we'll get into Rachel's theory, but could you give your version of a little bit of a summary of the book? Because otherwise I feel like some of these topics of conversations, there's so many things that you dive into in this book.
Sure. So the story comes about because my mother discovered her sexuality as a sexually dominant woman only when she was in her late 50s. So prior to that, she had had very unsatisfying relationships with men, or none at all. For a long time, she had none at all. So in her late 50s, she discovers this about herself, and shortly after that, gets kidney cancer. And in the course of the treatment for her kidney cancer, she loses the function in her remaining kidney and ends up on dialysis. And it turns out there's this interesting form of dialysis you can do at home, but it involves modifying your body in a kind of radical way so that you can pump fluid in and out of your abdomen. In any case, without going into the medical detail, it altered the way she thought about her body, but not in a negative way. So part of the beginning of the story is really about how the combination of her kinkiness and her illness allowed her to have more sexual freedom instead of less. So that's kind of where the story begins. Unfortunately, after about 3 years of that really vibrant sex life during her kidney cancer treatment, she then got a terminal cancer. And at that point, we enter what I think of as the end of her life, which was about an 8-month period. And the majority of the story is told focused on that 8-month period, where things like caregiving, hospital care, rehab care, and all of that stuff becomes the center of the story. But throughout the story, her sexuality and what that meant to her as a human being is a theme. And it's a theme that often gets lost when people are sick and being treated for illness, or when we just see them as old and somehow thus not sexual. So I wanted to write the book partly because my mother wanted her story told. There was a point when she was in the hospital where we thought about writing together. We had a lot of boundary issues. And anyway, I didn't feel like I could tell an emotionally honest story if we were doing it together. And she was just too weak and dealing with too much to really be able to write anything. But after she died, I spent a long time thinking about the story, and I had taken a ton of notes during the experience and decided that for both of us, I really wanted to write about this. So that's the context really for where this book comes from.
Yeah, and you talk about the notes and how the notes a little bit later on, I feel like you have this aha moment that they've actually been like a clutch potentially, like you are the primary care. What's the word?
Advocate, medical
advocate. Yeah, sorry. But also like you cling to this, the doctor at one point suggests, why don't you put the notebook down and just go in there as a daughter, not as the advocate role. And you have the kind of this existential moment of like, what do you mean? Put it down. Like,
I do. In fact, even just retelling that story and hearing other people reflect on that story still sends shivers down my spine. Because really the notebook was like a shield. It was an emotional barrier. It was a source of distancing. It was a way of imposing order. And yes, of course, it helped me advocate for her. But it created some separation that doctor pointed out. And that was a really tough moment.
Yeah. And you thread in the literal cross that's in your mother's BDSM life, as well as like this cross bearing all these crosses that you bear through your relationship. And one of those is this codependent relationship that you have with her. And it also struck me in that moment that you've kind of used these notes, which ended up being seemingly so useful in order to create this whole story and have like accurate reflection to be able to put into the story later on. But like these notes, the story part end up being kind of seeming from the outside, like almost like a liaison or a bridge of some sort of that codependency, like either allowing you to reflect on it or...
I think, one theme that I don't talk a great deal about in the book, but that comes up when people have read the book and talk to me about it afterwards, is that even if you take the sexuality and the healthcare themes out of the book, there's a lot that any child of an alcoholic parent is going to recognize in this story. And that kind of codependence is one outcome that many adult children of alcoholics, especially I think older children of alcoholics, like my sister had a very different experience. She was the younger one. She has her own issues. But for the oldest child, I think often maintaining order and separating emotion becomes key. And so even if you're not interested in the healthcare and sexuality part of the story, that is a part of the story that lots of people seem to resonate with. Incredibly common experience.
Yeah. All right. And so before we get too deep into this, because I know I'm already jumping around a lot. Rachel, could you share the theory that you've brought also for our reflection?
Absolutely. Well, just like Elizabeth, I also have carnal theories abound. And I wanted to be here, especially to speak to Bound and the experiences I had with it. And so the all-encompassing theory that I've been trying to live lately is that sexuality cannot and absolutely should not be viewed as a static, standalone state of being. It can't be viewed as in a vacuum. Instead, you should be able to view it from any sort of analytical lens. And conversely, there are plenty of areas of study that could use a sexually informed or a sexuality informed or an erotically informed lens. So you could consider it, the semiotics of the erotic. I'm very interested in parsing that out, and it's so beautifully done in this book. You're looking at it sociologically, you're looking at it emotionally, you're looking at it as a daughter, as a mental health advocate, as a family member, and so that's really what drew me to the book, and it's been informing my thought processes ever since.
Elizabeth, I'm curious about your reaction to that.
Well, it's obviously something that I feel strongly about myself, that, when I wrote this, one of the reasons I wrote it the way I did is because I thought you can't talk about caregiving without talking about sexuality. And you can't talk about sexuality as if it is this separate part of our lives that doesn't intersect with every other part of our lives. I'm really interested to hear what it was like for Rachel as she was reading it, because the experience of listening to Rachel read it for me was incredibly profound. But to hear that it had an impact on her like that is both gratifying, but also like pings all my curiosities.
Yeah. So Rachel, what drew you to this work, and what was the process like?
Elizabeth and I almost did not end up working together. I consider this one of the great examples of the universe for rewarding good behavior. I was my mentor and the head of my MFA program. His wife is a very accomplished actress who wanted to get into audiobooks. And so I love this work. I consider it the best job in the world, honestly. And I was showing her, here is where you can audition for some audiobooks. And I see one, and I almost feel guilty because I go, oh, Kate, this isn't for you. This is for me. But what you could do in this situation is email the author and say, hello, my name is Rachel Music. I'm terribly interested in this manuscript because not only was my mother in hospice, but I was a sex worker as well in BDSM. And I am fascinated by sociology and anthropology, which I studied at NYU. And I have my own touchy relationship with my mother. I would absolutely love to audition. And Elizabeth generously said, I'm basically done. I wasn't going to see any more or listen to any more options. So I as soon as I was finished with my lesson with this lovely woman, Kate, I went home and went, oh my gosh. I look at the audition script and I am captured. When I am not narrating, I'm a writer, have been as long as I can remember. And it's, it's so well written. It's so engagingly written right off the bat. And it's also written in a very a conversational and an intimate way where there's nothing cold or staid. And even when you can get some jargon thrown in there, Elizabeth manages to really make it feel as if she's speaking right to you. And that's the kind of work that is so gratifying to do. And luckily, our interests aligned. And working on this book started as a wonderful experience and happenstance. And as I got into the book, I was not prepared for the emotional journey that I went on. In order to do the book justice, I really wanted to, inhabit the emotional places that Elizabeth went. And the writing made it remarkably easy, but my own circumstances also did that. My mother and I have a very interesting and complicated and checkered past with one another. There are boundary issues all over the place. And I am only now, having moved to California a little under a year ago, working on extricating those boundaries. And I felt like I was going through a sort of pre-grief, going through Elizabeth's experience, where suddenly I'm meditating on things that I've never considered. Is, well, how is my relationship with her, and how would it be if we left it this way? Is there anything that we need to take care of, or are either of us in a place where we're emotionally equipped to tackle those conversations? Or as another option, am I okay with those developments or that relationship changing on my own? Which increasingly seems to be the case, but that does not preclude the fact that my mom and I can still have, helpful questing conversations in back into the realm of normalcy. But yeah, I feel myself going off the rails, and I want to tackle back to the baseline, but that is a little bit of how that journey went for me. It was really unanticipated, but exciting.
No, thank you. You brought up boundaries several times then, and one of the through line themes that stood out for me, at least, I don't know if it's intentional, but it was this underlining of consent in various ways. And a few of the ways that stand out to me the most, it's the consent and / boundaries relationship between your mother and her lovers. Consent and boundaries, which you go into detail about, and I'd like to go into that a little bit in a second. Consent and boundaries between you and your mother, and not just as advocate and mother, daughter and mother, but the two of you share, or she shares a lot of her sexual experiences with you. You're her sexual advocate in a lot of ways before you end up being her healthcare advocate in my eyes. And then there's this consent story of fucking hospitals. And there's a point where you really underline it, or maybe just, what am I saying? You underline it all the time, but where it really stood out to me, your mother's had a number of rectal insertions for a procedure that she needs to have. And there's been several of them, and she is really not having a good time about it, as one might imagine. And you reflect how she has yet to receive meaningful consent on this. Nobody asks her, might she have any trauma that might make this procedure be more difficult for her? Or is there just anything that she might want to tell the healthcare workers before this procedure that might make it a little easier? And so I see this thread of consent throughout, and it showcases for me just how lacking of consent throughout society. And it's an issue.
It's a big issue. And I don't think it's restricted to healthcare. I think it is pervasive, right? And one of the things that I reflected on during the experience, and then again in the writing, was that doctors and nurses, for example, could have so much to learn from sex educators about consent, and not just any sex educators, but particularly sex educators involved in educating about kink, I think, because those are probably some of the most well-developed consent practices out there. And ironically, the most parallel in terms of situational needs with somebody in the hospital. But it is pervasive. We have the same kind of consent problems when we tell kids, oh, go give grandma a kiss. And the kid doesn't want to. No, you must. Why must I? We're just not good at it. We want to assume too much, too often. Right. Yeah. But the story about those rectal tubes, that story is so powerful for a couple of reasons. And the consent reason is one. But the other thing that I think is kind of oddly charming about a story that involves a really miserable experience of an infection that causes just terrible, terrible diarrhea all the time, is that my mother's kink experience allowed her to reframe some of this in a way that, at least in her mind, I think, made it a little easier to deal with. So, for instance, she always called the rectal tube, which was intended, it's just a plastic tube that they stick up your ass, to try to drain the diarrhea out away from your skin, so it's not irritating you all the time. And lots of people don't want things put up their butts. But in any case, in her frame of reference, and she was a little bit unclear in general because of the illness, but from her frame of reference, it was a butt plug. Yeah. Which was a lot more familiar and thus a lot less scary. Now, it was still very uncomfortable. It was painful for her. She shouldn't have had to have so many of them. And there's one piece of that story where the nurse and I actually agree that we are not doing another one. If this one comes out, no more. And still she ends up with another one, because from the nurse's perspective, it wasn't the same as starting from scratch.
Yeah.
I won't explain the whole story because that's actually really kind of one of the dark humor moments in the book, and I don't want to take it away from anybody.
Elizabeth and I ended up having a little jingle that went along with it. So,
could you share?
No. Well, it's probably not. Well, I don't want to. It's the title of the chapter, Elizabeth. Do you think it would?
That's okay. Yeah, I think that's fine. You can do that. That's not a spoiler. You do it.
Well, we had to keep it light sometimes because, well, that's my nature. And I really loved the rapport and the camaraderie that we built. And so when I first sent her, chapter 7, consent, or I don't want another bug. And so we couldn't keep that in there because I'm sure Tina Turner's estate would have an issue with that. I don't know. I think she should cash in on it. But yeah, that chapter was particularly interesting because my grandmother, she passed away in 2020, and she was at home in hospice with my mother for months, and she had also had a really terrible bout of C. diff. So it was really interesting to have a sort of meta experience where I'm speaking to my mom about things I'm narrating, and she's of course happy because I'm talking to her about work and successful things. And I'm going, well, here are all these interesting similarities. And the medical professional in her is going, oh yeah, that's exactly how it goes. And being able to talk about this project, but unable to fully talk about the project. And so it's been very interesting because I have no, before I want to chat real, if I can, just in the interest of the universe speaking to itself. Just last night, I was at the premiere, and I don't know if either of you, I bet you would, that Abby Epstein and Ricky Lake, the team behind The Business of Being Born, they have another documentary called The Business of Birth Control.
Oh, excellent.
And I was there last night at the LA premiere. They were wonderful. Ricky and Abby were incredible. And there was so much talk of informed consent. The idea of here are people, myself included, put on birth control at 15 for non-contraceptive reasons and absolutely not told what this might do. I was fed the lie of, it's just your body thinking you're pregnant. It's fine. It's going to fix your skin and fix your skin. And if I had known for 12 years, oh, you're just not ovulating. You're absolutely out of whack. I mean, the idea that tide change is happening. I love, because what you said, Elizabeth, it's not just in healthcare and there's another side of it, but it is pervasive. And there's so many conversations around death and aging and butt stuff and poop, that we don't want to have. But the takeaway that I got from this documentary is that if you get women together and talking, magic happens, miracles happen. Suddenly we talk about, and it's just, I love that these silences are being lifted. And you're one of our patron saints.
Well, one of the things that I believe really strongly, and this isn't specifically a carnal theory, but it's kind of a theory of life, is that there's a radical power to personal storytelling. And that when we tell stories and we share stories with each other, and when we listen to other people's stories, we not only learn an awful lot about the world, but we discover information and tools we can use to change that world in exactly the ways that we need to. But we can't do it unless we share the stories.
Amen. To that point, you were just saying, Rachel, it's a nice tie-in in consent of this larger idea. And then I'd like to loop it back for a second, specifically about your mother's BDSM, but we enter hospitals against our consent. And then you say, and then once we're there and we have to sign all these papers to get it back. That disgustingly stood out to me. And I wondered if you had any feedback or thoughts, because you were the one really having to navigate all of this, like constantly going in and out of hospitals and renegotiating what the doctors were doing and maybe communicating to you or maybe not.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really noticed through my mother's illness is that, I mean, of course, nobody wants to be sick and go to the hospital. So while we do it because we, absent being committed for your own good against your wishes, most of us do decide, okay, I'm really sick, I have to go to the hospital. So in that sense, we consent, but we're not consenting freely. Really, we're being coerced in that case by our bodies, right? Our bodies are coercing us. And then we become captives in this system that in order to receive any treatment, we need to consent. And so there's another level of coercion there. We don't get to really pick and choose what to consent to. Consent forms tend to be very blanket forms. You consent to the treatment or you don't. You don't consent to part A and not part B. And once you've signed the form, if in fact it is an issue where there is a form to sign, it's kind of like a one-time deal. And if you talk to sex educators about consent and sexual interaction, there's a focus on chronically checking in, coming back to the idea that consent can be withdrawn at any point, that consent can be renegotiated. And that is absolutely not true or it doesn't feel true in the healthcare sense. Consent in the healthcare situation is very much a kind of rudimentary, relatively meaningless kind of thing. And then separate from the forms, when you're talking about nurses or aides or doctors coming into a room and interacting with you, it would be impossible for them to achieve meaningful consent frequently, because frequently they're not looking at you as an entire person. They're looking at you as, the kidney cancer in room 320 or something like that. Now, I have to say, my mom was in an amazingly good hospital and was treated by really caring nurses and doctors and aides particularly. I mean, I cannot say enough about the amazing nursing assistants and aides that took care of her. And they saw her. It's like the lower your level on the hierarchy, the more directly connected you are to the patient and the more likely you are to see the patient as a whole person. So there's a really charming story in there about an aide talking to my mom about a tattoo that she has. And it's a really human interaction, and it's different from what her interactions with doctors would have been like. It's like the healthcare system is so bureaucratic and so compartmentalized that even the doctors aren't whole people. They have more status and more power, but they're still, has renal been in? Or have you seen cardiology today? It doesn't matter which cardiology person that you saw. So when you remove the humanity from the people who are moving through the system, then it's hard to imagine that you could have something like meaningful consent.
Yeah. And they're minimized to just being different colors, different scrub colors.
Yeah. And I mean, thank goodness for the color coding in a way, because it made it very easy for me as the daughter or the advocate in that situation to find the person I needed in this big, overwhelming system. But, when you're in the system long enough, you start to know the individuals involved. And that happened for us. And I was really grateful for that. But for anybody who's lucky enough to have just a short-term stay in a hospital, that's not likely to happen at all.
And there's a section where you say you're starting to talk through what a BDSM session with your mother, what some of her lovers, what that might look like.
Yeah.
And you bring up consent.
Yeah.
And you start it by saying, like any other healthy relationship, a BDSM relationship is built on agency and consent.
Yeah.
And what you were just saying there is that agency is lost with the individuals, with the healthcare workers. And so that then gets passed on to the patients. The patients only have so much agency to begin with, particularly when specifically to their sexuality, because in culture and life, we agency is stripped away from us with our sexuality. So it just gets more and more difficult. And I love that section where you walked through what a session might look like, and you detailed how they discuss it.
Yeah.
And then if everything seems cool and copacetic, they might actually come and meet in person. Yeah. And then once they're there, they discuss it.
Yeah.
And they go and they sit at the table and they
Yep.
talk through what the contract is going to look like. And again, that makes me reflect on the hospitals.
Yeah.
How much detailing has really gone through at the hospitals of what these contracts include and don't include and might look like. And if not for all of your note taking, things get really lost. You have to have an advocate, which is why we have to be advocates for our own sexuality.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, when I think about the way that my mother interacted with her lovers, it really helped me understand and reminded me that BDSM and kink sexuality is often misunderstood by people who don't practice it as a really unequal power dynamic where one person's being harmed by another person. And it's really entirely the other way around. It's really in good practice. It's really probably the place in sexuality where consent is most clearly and openly negotiated. And I liked the way that my mother went about this. She often had email or text exchanges with people before they showed up. So she had an idea of what they were looking for, what they wanted, and they knew what her turn-ons and turn-offs were. Then they show up and they sit in the dining room for a bit and they talk and they see if there's chemistry and do they both want to do this. And then if they do, there's agreement about what some of the things might involve and some scene details and things like that. And then they move into another room where she sort of proceeds to ceremonially remove agency from them, as a dominant. Whereas in the hospital situation, it's all very unceremonious and we don't get a lot of good in-depth conversation about what could happen or what might not happen. We don't even understand a lot of the language being used much of the time. Medical details are really confusing. They're very technical. All we know is that we need to get better. We need somebody to help us. And that in order to do that, we have to just submit to this system. And that's not a great model for any of this.
Yeah. And it's looping back to what you said before, I couldn't agree more that kink sexual experts especially would make sense to be working in the hospital field. It would be a huge asset.
Yeah.
And my brain spurred a million business ideas when you mentioned that in the book towards the end. Yeah. And so some of these people that came in to try to help and maybe some of the escapes that you were also allowed during this journey. One of them is your work and time with the Woodhull Foundation, which I very much wanted to work into this interview. And I know you did too. So I was hoping you can talk about your time and work there.
Sure. Well, so the way it touches the story is because Ricky Levy, who's the executive director of Woodhull Freedom Foundation, actually, I think her title now is president and CEO. I should get it right. She is a dear friend of mine, and she was the one who gave me a place to live while I was in Philadelphia. She let me borrow her car when I needed it, and she and her husband and another good friend of theirs were all really emotionally supportive of me while I was going through the experience. But I met Ricky because of her organization, Woodhull Freedom Foundation, and we actually met in 2009 at the hospital where my mother was dealing with the original kidney cancer. That was our first meeting, was there at a sandwich shop right outside the hospital. So Ricky's really tied into this story from the beginning as well. But I remember sitting across from her at this sandwich shop outside the hospital, and she was telling me about her organization. Now, I'd been writing about sexuality and thinking critically about sex and society for about as long as I've been thinking critically about anything seriously. But she was telling me about this organization that she was running that put sexuality at the center of human rights and put human rights at the center of our thinking about how we advocate for sexuality. And that didn't compartmentalize. It didn't make it like, this is the reproductive justice portion, and this is the LGBT portion, and this is the kink portion, and this is the leather people. It was sexuality, whatever your sexuality. And it was the idea that sexuality and sexual freedom means the freedom to do things and the freedom not to do things. And so consent was a really important part of our early conversations. And I was so turned on by what she was doing that I said, I really have to get involved. And it turns out that is exactly how Woodhull grows as an organization. Ricky is that persuasive that just about anybody who has a conversation with her leaves the conversation saying, I have to get involved. But it's grown in those years. So, now we're in 2022. It's been a lot of time. We run a conference every year, Sexual Freedom Summit, that's in August, and that brings together people who are like lawyers, social workers, sex workers, sex educators, people who are just interested in thinking about these things. And it's rare to get all those folks in one room and hear them talk to each other as equals. So it's a really magical conference in that way. And then, we're also involved in legal advocacy. We are directly challenging the Sesta Fosta laws, which are probably too complicated for the time we have left. But the short version is they shut down free speech on the internet in a way that is intended to police prostitution, which is its own big topic. But actually shut down all kinds of things, including people's safety. So we're involved in a lawsuit challenging that piece of legislation. We're, of course, right now very concerned about all of the Don't Say Gay bills that are popping up and the abortion restrictions that are popping up. Censorship issues, books being taken out of libraries. There's just so much going on. But the basic idea,
only in the U.S.
and that's only in the U.S. Exactly. Yeah. So that's Woodhull in a really, really quick nutshell. But it is the only organization I know of that works in the U.S. at a national level that puts sexual freedom and human rights together in that way. So I'm a big cheerleader.
Yeah, it's a great thing to be a cheerleader for. A good way to spend time.
Yeah.
Definitely a fan.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah. As we start to wrap up, I wanted to make sure that both of you have an opportunity to speak about what you'd like readers to take away or listeners to take away. So I was hoping, Elizabeth, if you could give a little bit of what
Sure.
Of your writing of the book, what you'd like readers to be able to take away, and then Rachel, maybe a little differently from the listening side.
So one of the most important messages to me in this book is that we are all going to either be caregivers or need caregivers at some point in our lives. Almost all of us are going to be in one or the other, if not both of those situations. And so there are some things I think I learned from going through this with my mom that I hope people take away from this. And one is that the person who needs care has a whole life that might include pieces that the caregiver or the healthcare people don't know about or haven't heard about before. It's easy to make assumptions that we know what people want or need. And it's really important to stop and ask questions and listen. And if you're the person who needs care, it's important to be able to share enough about your life that people are able to give you the care that you really need, which goes well beyond whatever kind of health crisis or issue you're currently dealing with. And this is not an easy thing to ask of people, all in all. None of this that I'm talking about. And so the main kind of really big umbrella lesson I would hope people take away is this is all going to be so much easier if we can talk about it before we're sick. If we can talk about it before we really need to, because that's when we have more freedom. That's when we're not in that coercive situation. So the more we can be open about sexuality and about mortality, and I really do think like sex and death are two sides of many of the same conversations. If we can be open about our mortality, if we can be open about our sexuality, we are going to get better care and be able to provide better care.
Yeah. And would you also say that we need to push and be working to empower doctors with the questions that they can ask? Because when we're in the hospital or we're in the office, we're in their court. Like they're supposed to be the ones running the show. We're paying them to do so.
And depending on their expertise and their skill. Yeah. If I were thinking about what are the takeaways specifically for medical professionals here, for doctors, for nurses, then my big takeaway is find yourself some kinky people and talk to them. Not to get information about how to do kink, which might not be your thing, but about bodies, about consent, about the experience of negotiating, about communicating clearly, about being able to talk about fears and desires, because just about any healthcare situation is going to involve a patient's fears and desires,
and pleasure.
Absolutely. And capacity for pleasure. There's a woman named Joan Price who does a lot of work on sexuality and aging, and she has a medical mantra that she teaches in her workshops. And it's a way that patients can confront their doctors with the questions, because they know that the doctors are generally not trained and experienced with asking them. And I never remember her exact words, but the basic situation is, doctor, my sexuality matters to me. My pleasure is important to me. These are some things that are interfering with it. Can you help me figure out how to solve these problems? And if you can't, can you refer me to somebody who can? And it needs to be a mantra, because it's not something that we naturally think to say. So we need to practice it over and over until it becomes easy to say. I would much rather see a situation where the medical school curriculum includes all this stuff up front, and where training of doctors and nurses includes all of this stuff. We're not there yet. So we as patients and advocates have to do a lot of it. Yeah,
because you mentioned at one point how masturbation or how your mother's sexuality never gets pulled into her potential healing treatment.
No.
And what a potential missed opportunity for everybody, but especially because that was already such a large part of your mother's life and had healed her seemingly in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And in her story,
really modality.
And it really could have been. And what I was puzzling over for a while I was writing the story is, why didn't she and I raise it? And, because obviously she wasn't ashamed, and obviously she and I were open with each other. But the real truth there is that her fear of being treated differently by medical professionals if they knew these things about her was strong enough that it felt safer not to raise it.
And how terrifying.
Right.
You two clearly open, clearly communicative, clearly, and still there is such a boundary between the two worlds that it is just that uncomfortable that you don't bring it up.
And a fear of stigma. I mean, there's so much stigma around all kinds of sex in our society, right? Though people wouldn't necessarily recognize it, it is entirely possible that sexual freedom movements like the one that My Sex Bio is pushing and advocating for, that those could actually improve healthcare. That if we destigmatize sex, we could improve healthcare. Imagine that.
Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth. Rachel, I'd love your thoughts on the listener's experience, if there's takeaways that you have.
If folks are listeners as opposed to readers, I hope that their takeaway is similar to what mine was. And like I said from the beginning, it was very clear that Elizabeth and I were kindred spirits. We're both elder daughters with boundary issue moms and compartmentalizers and caretakers and mediators. And even with all of those similarities, one huge point of jealousy, in fact, is something that you just brought up, Elizabeth, is the shamelessness.
Yeah.
I read this chapter about how supportive your mother was during your own quest for contraception and your sexual awakenings and all that entailed, and was so jealous. That is diametrically opposed to my upbringing, which was nothing but stigma. And here is the pill, but it is for your cycles. It is not for sex. Don't you dare. I think that it comes back to this idea of body autonomy. And I think that doctors have a lot to respect, and I respect their time and effort and expertise, but they so often fall short in bedside manner and in issues of agency and in issues of humanity. And probably it's systemic. It's not the fault of the individual doctor. And I think that there is a future where we meet them halfway, and whether it's knowing, well, my cycle is this, and this is how ovulation affects my body, or if it's this is the type of dialysis I would prefer for my own lifestyle. Bringing solutions and actively taking it. I think of it as nobody likes help me. Nobody likes an open hand, but people do like puzzles, and I think that doctors are much the same. So all this to say, I have so much in common with Elizabeth, but even if you have one, you'll find one thing listening to it, even if your background is wildly, radically different. And there's so much hope and optimism packed into something that can often feel like you could have just done a dress down of the entire health system and it would be warranted, but you manage to offer solutions. And I think that's so fantastic and something that's very sorely needed right now.
And in an entertaining and relatable way.
Thank you.
Right?
It's a lovely story.
Thank you.
It's a lovely story, really. And it's well performed as well, Rachel, truly.
It is incredibly well performed.
Yeah.
You're very sweet. Thank you.
Well, as we come to the end of our conversation today, I do want to loop back on the two Carnal theories that were brought. Elizabeth, could you share the Carnal theory?
Sure.
For our consideration again?
So I think of it as having three parts. And the first part is that sexuality is not erased by illness or aging. The second part is that we don't give up our human right to sexual freedom in exchange for healthcare or caregiving services. And then the third part is that when we can face our mortality, this allows us to live our fullest and most authentic lives, and that includes our sex lives.
Yes. Yeah, and we didn't end up touching too deeply on the death side of things, but there's strong ties, as you briefly mentioned, between the taboos wrapped around sexuality and the fear and taboos wrapped around sexuality and the fear and taboos wrapped around death and our mortality in general. And I would argue that if we could start to weed whack at one, maybe preferably the sexuality side, that the other might end up looking a little bit better too, and not so scary.
Yeah, they are very deeply connected. If you ever want to do a show on that, I'd be happy to come back and focus just on that.
Lovely. Let's discuss for sure. And Rachel, could you reshare your Carnal theory?
Sure. The idea simply that sexuality is not one be-all, end-all sphere that you can monitor or understand in a vacuum, that you need to zoom out and you have to see its intersections with all different areas of study and all different phases and areas of life.
Yes, these are systemic issues for sure. Thank you both so much for coming on this show. Elizabeth, thank you for your work. Rachel, thank you for your work. I look forward to talking again.
Thank you, Abba.
Our pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. We hope that this episode has given you something further to reflect upon. It certainly has for me. Please reach out to us with your questions or insights on our Instagram page at Carnal Theory or our sister parent organization. Strange familiar relationship there. MySexBio, mysexbio.org. And please check out and learn more about Elizabeth's work from her website, Elizabeth Ann Wood, and that's Ann with an E, elizabethannwood.com. You can get bound there, and you can also find Rachel on Audible as well as social media platforms if you go hunting, and learn more about her work and work with her as a narrator. Thank you all so much. Look forward to hearing from you in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.